Hello and welcome to the Stack Exchange. My name is Tyler, and today I've got a new type of video to this channel, and that is deck reviews. Today I'm going to be reviewing my friend's Indoraptor, the perfect hybrid deck. This deck belongs to my friend Luke, who has been mentioned not by name but mentioned in a couple of the past videos, which you may recognize him by. He's the Eldrazi player of our pod. He's also the one who voiced the Golgari character in my recent Linden deck tech video. So let's dive right into just a general look at this deck. So the commander for this deck is Indoraptor, the perfect hybrid, which is a 3-cost Jund commander, which has the keyword Bloodthirst and Menace, as well as an Enrage ability. To start, we have Bloodthirst, which means that when Indoraptor enters, it gets counters equal to the amount of damage dealt to your opponents this turn. Indoraptor's Enrage ability is when it takes damage, you pick an opponent at random and then deal damage to them equal to its power unless they choose to sacrifice a non-token creature. So, as you may have already guessed, this deck is all about dealing a bunch of damage to your opponents to get Indoraptor to enter huge, and then pinging Indoraptor a bunch of times to fling damage at everyone. Let's get right into the deck. For starters, we have Grim Gigantosaurus as a board wipe creature. I put it under board wipe because it is 7 cost, 10/10 with Monstrous 10, which costs 10 in Golgari, which is discounted for the amount of creatures your opponents control that have power 4 or greater. When it becomes monstrous, it destroys all artifacts and all other creatures aside from it, so it is a board wipe, albeit a very expensive one, but then you also have a big 20/20 and a completely open board. We also have Blasphemous Act in the deck to board wipe, of course, and if Indoraptor is large enough, it will survive, and even if it isn't, it's still receiving damage from Blasphemous Act, thus getting a final ping in before it dies. The next category we have are buff and keywords. These are cards that either give a small buff, or they have some sort of keyword on it to further make our commander more able to swing in at opponents. For starters, we have Primal Might, which is X and a green. Target creature you control gets +X/+X till end of turn and fights up to one target creature you don't control. You'll see a decent number of fight spells in this deck because you would have your commander receiving damage as it fights, so that would then proc the Enrage ability. Next, we have Shadow Spear, which gives +1/+1, trample, and lifelink. Good keywords already, but it also has the ability to remove hexproof and indestructible from your opponent's creatures, being able to stop people from trying to avoid a board wipe or something similar. Next, we have Power Fist, which gives trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many counters on it. Next, we have the classic Garruk's Uprising, 3 cost, which if it enters and you already have a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and then whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters, you also draw a card. So a good bit of card advantage while also giving your creatures trample. Rhythm of the Wild is a 3-cost Gruul card, which makes it so your creature spells can't be countered, and it gives your non-token creatures Riot, which basically means they can enter with haste or with a 1/1 counter on them. This gives a little bit more protection to all the creatures in this deck, while also allowing you to swing in with some big creatures right off the bat when they enter. Return of the Wild Speaker, classic overrun effect, giving all of your non-human creatures +3/+3 until end of turn, or you can use it to draw a bunch of cards, since Indoraptor, in my experience, is consistently getting to about 12 power based off of the upgrades I made to the deck. And finally, among the buffs and keywords, we have Xenagos, God of Revels, and it has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, another target creature gains haste and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the creature's power. Another one of those cards to basically double the power and toughness of your creatures. Moving on, we now have card advantage. Already talked about it, but we have Garruk's Uprising and Return of the Wild Speaker. We also have Cleopatra, Exiled Pharaoh. Cleopatra puts a counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures at the beginning of your end step, and then whenever a legendary creature you control dies, you draw a card for each counter on it, and then you lose 2 life. So if you have Cleopatra out, and let's say Indoraptor dies, you're going to be drawing a lot of cards. Next, we have Ripjaw Raptor, Ripjaw Raptor has an Enrage ability similar to Indoraptor, except when it is dealt damage, you draw a card. So with all the things in this deck that are trying to ping stuff, this can be a very good source of draw. Next, we have the classic Earth Shaker Dreadmaw, which when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each other dinosaur. This deck is a very dinosaur-heavy deck, if you can imagine, since Enrage is a primarily dinosaur mechanic. Next, we have Itali Primal Conqueror, which when Itali enters, each player exiles the top of their library, and then you get to cast any number of spells from them without paying their mana cost. It can also be transformed into an 11/11 with Trample Indestructible and what is essentially Infect. Lastly, we have Vault-Born Tyrant, which when it or another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. Similar effect to Garruk's Uprising. But then when it dies, if it is not a token, you create a token that's a copy of it, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. Next, we have what I classified as cheating cards, and this is cheating creatures out. First, we have Hunting Velociraptors, which basically says if you dealt damage with the dinosaur this turn, you can pay 3 to cast a dinosaur. And then second, we have the classic Halta Stampede Tyrant. Enter the battlefield, put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Our next category is counters. We already covered most of them: Power Fist, Rhythm of the Wild, and Cleopatra, Exiled Pharaoh. The one we didn't cover, though, is Rite of Passage, which has whenever a creature you control is dealt damage, you put a 1/1 counter on it. Next, we have an evasion section. I put question mark because of Spitting Dilophosaur, because when it enters or attacks, you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, and creatures with a -1/-1 on them can't block. So it's kind of like evasion. And then there's a Rogue's Passage, which makes it so a creature can't be blocked this turn. Now we have a couple of fight spells in here. Primal Might, we already mentioned. There's Savage Stomp, which costs 2 less if it's targeting a dinosaur, and you put a counter on the creature and have it fight. There's Gimli's Reckless Might, 4-cost enchant that gives your creatures haste, and whenever you attack with creatures with a total power of 8 or greater, you can have one of those creatures fight another creature. There's also Brash Taunter, which is a Stuffy Doll effect. When it's dealt damage, you deal that much damage to an opponent. You can also pay into it to have it fight a creature. And lastly, there's Apex Altasaur, which is when it enters, it fights a creature, and when it's dealt damage, it fights another creature. So it's basically able to continue fighting until it's dead or until you stop. Next, let's move on to haste enablers. We have Rhythm of the Wilds and Gimli's Reckless Might, which we already mentioned. There's Regisaur Alpha, which has gives all your dinosaurs haste, and when it enters, you make a 3/3 dinosaur creature token with Trample. We also have the classic Swiftfoot, Boots, and Lightning Greaves. Now we have a couple cards that make tokens. These include Compy Swarm, which makes a copy of itself if a creature died this turn, but that's only on your end step, so it's not each turn, it's just your turn. Next, we have Welcome to ... It's a saga, so for the first saga, you get to turn an artifact each of your opponents control into a wall. Second chapter of the saga, you make a 3/3 dinosaur with Trample and Haste. And then for the third step of the saga, you destroy all walls and then exile it and return it on the other side. It returns as Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park taps for a green equal to the amount of dinosaurs you control. It also gives all your dinosaurs escape costs equal to their mana value, plus an additional exiling of 3 cards from your graveyard. Like mentioned before, we already have Regisaur Alpha, and then the last one is Polyraptor, which is an 8-cost with Enrage, and basically when it takes damage, you make a copy of it. Now onto our pinging cards. To start, we have the 3 Thunder Junction Ping Deserts. So those just allow you to deal 1 damage to an opponent when they enter the battlefield. We also have Mount Doom, which you can pay 1 and Rakdos into it to deal 1 damage to each of your opponents. We have Creeping Bloodsucker, which deals 1 damage to each of your opponents, and then you gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. We have Marauding Raptor, which discounts your creature spells by 1, and when a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Marauding Raptor deals 2 damage to it, and then Marauding Raptor gets +2 attack. This is really good for all those enraged creatures. They enter, they take some damage right away, so you get the effect. Next, we have Spiteful Banditry, which when it enters, it deals X damage to each creature, where you pay an X into red to cast it. And then whenever 1 or more creatures your opponents control die, create a treasure token, and this only triggers once a turn. so you can get a good amount of treasure out of this. Next, we have Mayhem Devil, which is whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, deal 1 damage to any target. As you may have remembered, Indoraptor that gives people the opportunity to either take damage or sacrifice a non-token creature. If they choose to sacrifice it, you just ping Indoraptor again, and you go right back to it. Next, we have Scytheclaw Raptor, which deals 4 damage to a player if they cast a spell not on their turn. If anyone tries to respond to you, you get to deal 4 damage to them, and this also buffs up that Bloodthirst. Next is Pyrohemia, which you sacrifice at the end of the turn if there are no creatures in play, and you can also pay 1 red into it to deal 1 damage to each creature and player. Not only does this proc your range abilities, but also can deal damage to your opponents to buff up Bloodthirst. Next we have Raging Ragesaur, which has when it attacks, deal 1 damage to any target. Another good way to proc and rage. We have Brash Taunter, which we already mentioned. Raging Swordtooth, which is when it enters, it deals 1 damage to each other creature. And we have Wrathful Raptors, which is when a dinosaur is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target that isn't a dinosaur. So as you ping your dinosaurs for their enrage abilities, you get to throw out that damage at other people's creatures as well. And lastly, we have the Ravenous Tyrannosaurus, which has Devour 3, and whenever it attacks, it can deal damage equal to its power up to 1 target creature, and any excess damage is dealt to its controller. Moving on to protection, we already talked about Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. We also have Heroic Intervention and Deflecting Swat. For ramp, we have Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Farseek, Golgari Signet, Gruul Signet, previously mentioned Marauding Raptor, Nature's Lore, Rakdos Signet, Spiteful Banditry, which we also mentioned earlier, 3 Visits, Cultivate, Descent into Avernus, which can be very good because not only will it generate you a bunch of treasures, but will also deal a bunch of damage to everyone to get Bloodthirst up. Kodama's Reach, Ranging Raptors, which have Enrage, search for a basic and put it on the battlefield tapped. Welcome to Jurassic Park. And then Hulking Raptor, which will add 2 green at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. In terms of recursion, we have Reanimate and Welcome to Jurassic Park when it's on its flipped side. For removal, we have Lightning Bolt, Primal Might, Assassin's Trophy, Terminate, Beast Within, Chaos Warp, Savage Stomp, Welcome to Jurassic Park, Deadly Rollick, Gimli's Reckless Might, Silverclad Ferocidons, which have Enrage, each opponent sacrifices a permanent, and then Apex Altasaur. We also have the Ozolith to save some counters, Diabolic Tutor, and Savage Order, both to help us find creatures that can help us. In terms of lands, the only real ones of note is we have Cavern of Souls to make our dinosaurs uncounterable, and then we have Path of Ancestry to get a little extra scry in. Overall, this is not a bad deck by any means, but there are a few switches I would make to streamline the deck a little more and make it slightly more consistent. To start with, let's go over the cards I'm going to cut and why. I would cut Gahalta, Stampede Tyrant. I think since you have a 3-cost commander, I wanted to avoid any of the higher cost cards and keep the curve a lot lower. So we would be doing a lot more lower cost casting. That's why Gahalta, Earthshaker Dreadmaw, Apex Altasaur, Regisaur, Silverclad Ferocidon, Atali, Vaultborn Tyrant. That's why all of those got cut, including Grim Gigantosaurus. I cut all of those primarily because they were just too expensive for the curve I was looking for. There are some other reasons as well, of course, but among the other cards I also cut, I cut Terminate I switched it out for a little bit better removal. I cut Xenagos because, once again, 5 cost was a little slow, and I tried to avoid these, big buff things. I also cut Power Fist for the same reason. I'm focusing more on pinging your commander a lot more than getting them really big and then doing, a couple one-off larger pings. I cut Spitting Dilophosaurus because it just seems really bad in a deck that doesn't care about -1/-1 counters. I get the thematic fitting to it, but it does not work as well in the deck. I cut Compy Swarm because, at least in the 1 or 2 games I've watched, it doesn't proc as much as I would like it to. I cut Raging Swordtooth because it's 5 cost, and it's only 1 proc of damage. There's a lot cheaper options to get the 1 proc on my commander or everything else, so I figured it'd be better to cut it for something a little more mana efficient. In terms of mana rocks, I cut Golgari Signet and Rakdos Signet. There was not as much of a need for black mana after I made my swaps. That's also why I cut stuff like Golgari Farm and Rakdos Carnarium and some swamps. I cut a lot of lands that included black because there's just not a lot of black mana needed for this deck, especially because the commander has hybrid black-green in its cost, so you don't even need black to cast it. Of the cards I cut, the one I would consider keeping in the most is Rite of Passage. Rite of Passage is whenever the creature is dealt damage, you put a counter on it. With all the things that are dealing 1 damage, this means you can essentially ping them forever. Especially with Mayhem Devil, this means you basically get to either hit everyone once or take out all of their non-token creatures. Now, moving beyond cuts, let's move to what I think to add. For starters, Slagstorm. Honestly, I think this is a card just made for this deck. Slagstorm can either deal 3 damage to each creature or 3 damage to each player. This is perfect for whether you already have your commander out or you don't. You can choose to do the 3 damage to each player if you need to still cast your commander, or 3 damage to each creature if your commander is already out there. I also went in and added a lot of the MBFCs. Bridgework Battles is a fight spell. Revitalizing Repast is a protection spell. Ball Again Recovery is recursion. Shatterskull Smashing is a way to ping your creatures for the enrage ability. Stump Stomp is another fight spell. Same with Colony Ambush. Spikefield Hazard's another ping spell. Malika Rebirth's another protection. And Cuzzle's Fury is a fling spell for if your commander is going to die. As for other lands, I also added Witch's Clinic, an easy way to give lifelink to your commander to keep your life total up. There's also Zatora's Proving Grounds. I swapped this out for the previous 3-color Triome, the Savage Lands, because it is the all 3 land types, so something like Nature Lore can find it. Lastly, I added an extra Forest in there because of the shifting and color balancing, and then Arena of Glory to give haste to a creature if you need to. Getting back on track, I added Darksteel Plate. If you give your commander Indestructible, it doesn't matter if you're going into the red, basically, for life total. You can just keep pinging your commander. Next, we have Volcanic Fallout, which it can't be countered, which is nice, so it's always going to get through. And this deals 2 damage to each creature and player. Once again, similar to Slagstorm with how it can be used, whether your commander's out or not. It's just a slight more drawback just because you don't get to choose. It's all or nothing, essentially. Next is Kalothis, God of Destiny. I think this is a really fitting card for the deck because at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you get to exile something from a graveyard. So first, you get some graveyard hate to remove people who are graveyard players. Next, if it's a land you exiled, you can add red or green. And if it's not, you gain 2 life and deal 2 damage to each of your opponents. Another great way to deal damage to each of your opponents and build up that Bloodthirst. I also added Grape Shot, which is deal 1 damage to any target, and Storm. This is another great option for pinging down your opponents to gain a bunch of Bloodthirst, or to ping your commander a bunch of times to get a bunch of triggers. I also added Mithril Coat. Mithril Coat gives Indestructible, and it has Flash. It's basically Darksteel Plate, but with Flash on it. I also added Tainted Strike. This is a damage-focused deck. Of course, it has commander damage as an alternative way to win, but it also runs the risk of getting targeted a lot with the commander. I think Tainted Strike is a good way to sneak out a win if you need to. For instance, a life game player is like, yeah, sure, I'll take the 20 damage because I have 150 health. And as they say that, you cast Tainted Strike, giving Infect, and then that's 20 poison counters and they're dead. It's a good way to sneak out a win on people you wouldn't usually be able to kill. I also added Bushwhack. Bushwhack's one of those cards that Tristan and I call semi-MDFCs because they cost 1 and they search for a basic land. So essentially it's the same as putting out a tapped basic land, which is what a MDFC basically is. On top of that, it also has a fight spell attached to it. Next, I added Forerunner of the Empire. Forerunner of the Empire is a dinosaur tutor, as well as having it whenever a dinosaur enters, it deals 1 damage to each creature. So whenever you're casting dinosaurs and having them enter, it procs all those enrage abilities. I also added Bolt Wave. 1 cost, deals 3 damage to each opponent. this gives 9 counters to your commander, and it's just super, super mana efficient. Next, I have Untimely Malfunction, which is a very good red staple card. It can destroy an artifact, it can change the target of a spell or ability, or it can make 1 or 2 creatures unable to block this turn. I did Culling Ritual, which destroys each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less, and it gives you any combination of Golgari mana for each permanent destroyed this way. I think this is a really good way to deal with token decks. Even though they can't sacrifice a token for the Indoraptor's ability, they can still use it to block Indoraptor from getting through if you're trying to win through combat damage. For that reason, Culling Ritual is really good at wiping them all out and giving you a good chunk of mana. Rakdos Charm is another little bit of token deck hate. Each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. On top of that, this is a good way to build up your Bloodthirst. It also can remove an artifact and exile a player's graveyard. I think Rakdos Charm is a great way to just hate out all those kind of deck types, tokens, graveyards, and the like. Next, I have Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, which is whenever you have a creature enter with the greatest power, you get to draw a card. You can also pay a green and tap it, and add X mana of any combination where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Like I said, I usually find that you have Indoraptor at like 12, so getting 11 mana out of this is kind of insane. Next is Neith of the Dire Hunt, which is whenever you have 1 or more creatures fight, or if they become blocked, you get to draw a card. Since there are a decent amount of fight spells in here, you're going to get to draw cards off of that. On top of that, since you're going to have such a big commander threat, people aren't going to want to take the commander damage and are going to be forced to block. On top of that, Neith has the ability to pay 3 at the beginning of combat and double a creature's power, which makes the Enrage ability deal even more damage. I also added Screaming Nemesis to this deck, another Stuffy Doll-like effect, 3 cost 3/3 with haste, and when it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target. If that target is a player, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. Another great way to hate out life gain decks. I think Luke is going to like these changes with the little bits of life gain hate I put in here. As you may have seen in my Linden deck tech, he is not the biggest fan of my life gain deck. I also put Grab the Prize in here. It's a discard, draw 2 cards, and then deal 2 damage to each of your opponents. Good amount of damage to opponents on top of cards. Next, there's Etoric's Command. Costs Gruel, you get to choose 2. One option is your opponents can't gain life this turn. The next is deal 3 damage to each of your opponents. Third, you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. And lastly, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain reach until end of turn. Very versatile card with lots of effects this deck wants. And the last thing I added to this deck is Zerta Druid, which is cost Gruel, and it can be tapped to add green, but whenever you tap it, you deal 1 damage to each of your opponents. Another way to drain your opponents while getting some ramp on the board. And that's it for the deck. If you have any thoughts on any of the swaps I made or anything you would do differently, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the idea of doing more deck reviews like this. I will put the link to both versions of this deck list in the comments below, as well as a link to Luke's Mox Field. If you enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, please drop a like and subscribe to get notified whenever we are uploading. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye.